Hi, my name is Cecile Johnson, and I am CEO of African Development Plan. I'm here today with Global City Unity, and what I'll be doing is talking about some data on the current state of African Americans in Illinois. So this project is a project of African Development Plan, and some of my background is I'm a researcher. I have a master's in inner city studies from the Center for Inner City Studies here in Chicago, and a bachelor's in communications. But what's really most important is that I have been doing research on the Black community. I've lived in many different places across the country, and everywhere I've gone, I see a pattern of behavior and in the data that has been a little bit disturbing. So here in Illinois, I'm going to be going through some data that talks about what's going on with us, because community needs to become more involved in finding solutions. Milton Friedman, an economist at the University of Chicago, says, all crisis creates a change, and the change that occurs from the ideas that are lying around. He said, our goal is to create the ideas that are lying around, so when the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable, those ideas are implemented. Well, I say this for the Black community, not only in Chicago, but nationwide. What is our plan? What are our ideas? What do we have lying around? So this data that I have created, first focus Chicago, Illinois, because I live here in Illinois, but it's also part of a bigger set of research that I've been doing on the state of the Black condition in America. So what I do is called connecting the dots. I look at research that's already out there, and I begin to connect it, so you begin to see that we actually have a crisis. What should be very disturbing to some is the Census Bureau has already predicted that for 2050, the African American population will be 11.9%, and the Latino population would have grown to over 30-something%. So the question is, if we are more than 11.9% now, in some places in Illinois 14%, then what is it that happened to the Black people? So some of this data that I'm going to be talking to you about is showing you some patterns of what's happening with us, and if you look at what's going on, you can then conclude why they can already project in 2050 where we are going to be less than we are right now. So as Black people, we need to be concerned. It's not anyone's responsibility to save us. It is our responsibility to save ourselves. So let's go into some of the data. In America today, the big question is his life, and usually a white life, as you can see from the many incidents that have been happening on the TV, more important than a Black life, right? Most of us, when we have our children, we have to be asking them, giving them all kind of special instructions, right? Put on your jacket, keep your hands up inside at all times. Don't make any sudden move, shut your mouth, all of this. Why? We're supposed to be equal citizens in this country, so why do we have to give our own children special instructions just to survive? Well, there's a reason for that, right? We have a crisis, and the crisis that's facing the Black community is all across the nation, right? We have more people today politically in office, including a Black president, and yet the state of Black people is worse than it has ever been. So this year is 2015. It's 150 years since 1865, when we allegedly were freed, right? So what we're going to be doing is talking about, like I said, focusing on Chicago and Illinois in this first set of data that I'll be giving. So in Chicago, you can see that the population is 32.9% Black, right? Even though we're 14% of the population in the state. And between 2000 and 2010, we actually lost 177,401 Black people in Chicago. So there is a woman here in Chicago called Melody Hobson. Melody Hobson is president of Aerial Funds, and she says we must deal with the issue of race. The first step of solving any problem is not to hide from it, right? The first step to any form of action is awareness. So this presentation is about awareness. She says, I work in the investment business, and we have a saying, the numbers don't lie. And the numbers show clearly that there are significant disparities in household wealth, in income, in job opportunity, and much more. So there's something called the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is about what can people do and be And it's the process of improving people's well-being and expanding their freedoms and opportunities. In the past, what you used to do is you look at the economy and you would say, okay, that's how the people are doing. But that's not how the world globally is looking at it now. I mean, what good is the economy allegedly is doing well, but the black people are doing horribly. So it's more important to know, well, how are they doing? And how do we judge how they're doing? We look at something called a long and healthy life. We look at access to knowledge, which is education. And do we have a decent standard of living? So in 2010, the Human Development Index for the country on a whole was 5.03. And when you looked at that, you could see that the highest, that was for the whole country, but the highest ranking group were Asians. Theirs was 7.21, followed by whites, which was 5.43. Latinos were 4.05, and African Americans came in at a dismal 3.81. The only people lower than us were the Native Americans at 3.55. So here you have an average of 5.03, and we are at 3.81. Well, why is that? So let's look at how we're doing when we talk about a long and healthy life. In 2012, the national life expectancy for white men was 74.79 years. For black men, it was 67.66 years. So that's a difference of 7.13 years. But that's not the news at this point. The news was that when I had done this data before, in 2007, the 2007 data, that was the last data, it said that life expectancy for a black man was 70. So now it's 67.66. So between 2007 and 2012, we've lost 2 years, right? And in the state of Illinois, we have one of the largest gaps in racial life expectancy, which is a gap greater than 8 years. When it comes to black women, same thing. In 2012, white women had a life expectancy of 78.79 years. Black women, 73.59 years. This was a difference of 5.2 years. But when you looked at the data that I had previously had, which was from 2007, you saw that there was a decrease because in 2007, black women's life expectancy was 76.8. So they have lost 3 years. Now, this is important because we live in a so-called developed, one of the most developed countries in the world, and yet we spend 17% of our GDP on health, and yet we have, as it relates to life expectancy for a particular group of people, black people, we are losing time, okay? That should be very disturbing to people. So there was a study that came out in 2012 that said where you live impacts how long you live. So I've just told you that there's a gap. We've lost 2 and 3 years respectively for black men and women in in Illinois. But in Chicago, depending on where you live, the difference in life expectancy can be as much as 14 years. So in households with median incomes higher than $53,000 a year versus where a lot of blacks have incomes below $25,000 a year, you find that there's a 14-year gap. And when I found this information, it had actually, I had been noticing this. I've been noticing that I had meet people and they tell me their parents and family members are dying in their 50s, and coming from a family that people live till they're 100 and plus, I thought that was very strange. So when I saw this, I was like, wow, this is beginning to explain this. Now, why is that? Because a lot of these poor health outcomes have a lot to do with the fact that Chicago is still a very segregated city. And because it's segregated, it means that when it comes to not only poverty, but when it comes to access to food, all of this, lowest educational attainment, lowest access to food, that's all part of the history of the segregation that has happened here, right? Most communities you go into, they look all like us or they look all like them. It's very, very little mixing going on. So where you live has a big impact. Now, when it comes to grocers and fast foods in Chicago by race, black people. So it's not necessarily just people who have low income, because Latinos are not as well off as whites. But when it comes to fast food, blacks have the biggest gap. It is much easier in our community to go and get a hamburger, some fried chicken, all these things that are not good for you, than it is to get fresh fruit and vegetable. You are what you eat. So this is having impact. You'll see most of the new businesses coming up in our community have to do with diabetes clinics and all of these things. Again, that's not a solution, you know. What is causing what is happening to us? So the average distance in miles by city or of Chicago blocks for African American to a chain store is 0.77 mile, and to small grocers 0.86. For every other group, it is about half a mile. So communities that have no or distant grocery stores have an imbalance in health options, which likely have increased premature death and chronic health conditions. And we're seeing that again in the data and the results and the poor health of our community. But there was another study that came out, and it said that inequality in America begins in the womb. Well, wouldn't that make sense? If your mother is not getting proper nutrition, she doesn't have proper health care, if she's living under a lot of stress of poverty and living in black life in America, these things are going to impact the child in the womb. And so children born into disadvantage are, by the time they start kindergarten, already at a risk of dropping out of school, right? They're starting and they're already at a risk of dropping out. Teen pregnancy, crime, and a lifetime of low-wage work. So, for instance, babies born prior to the 37th week of gestation or weighing less than 5.5 pounds will be disadvantaged for the rest of their lives, not just in health issues, but also in lifetime earnings. The emotional stress that many of our people are experiencing, also from poverty, also is going to impact the fetus. And a lot of people live in older buildings, and some of these buildings have lead and other toxins. And again, that's also impacting the fetus. So what you find in Chicago is mortality rates for black infants are nearly triple that of whites, right? Whites are consistently at 5 per 1,000. And blacks are 14 per 1,000, are at 14 per 1,000. And when you look at what they call maternal mortality, and I have to say this, globally there's an international standard called the Millennium Development Goals, right? And what happened is in the year 2000, 189 countries came together and they said we can end poverty. And they decided to set up what they call the Millennium Development Goals, which are some standards. And the standards include goal number 1, which is poverty, end poverty. Number 2 was to have education for everyone, universal education. 3 was gender equity. 4 was infant mortality. So when I'm telling you about what's going on with the black community here as it relates to infant mortality, again, we live in a developed country, yet we have 5 whites die and 14 in the state of Illinois, black children die, and we live in a country that spends 17% of its GDP on health. When it comes to maternal mortality for women, you find the same thing. Black women are 3.4 times more likely to die giving birth than white women. And in this case of Chicago, there was a 5-year data gap where they looked at 2000 to 2004, and 1 white woman died, 27 black women died. Again, big gap. So what are the 10 causes of death for black Americans between 1980 and 2007? As you can see, heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes is now number 4. Diabetes was number 8 in 1980. It's now risen up to the number 4 one in 2007. Unintentional injuries, homicide, chronic lower respiratory diseases, kidney disease, HIV wasn't on the list in 1980, but it is now at number 9. And when you look at black communities, you find that patient-to-doctor ratios in 12 Chicago neighborhoods equal that of a third world country. I really don't like the term third world, right? It's a developing country, but our black communities are equivalent to a third world or developing country. And some of these communities are Ashburn, Auburn Gresham, Austin, Brighton Park, Chatham, Cage Park, Hermosa, Rogers Park, Montclair, Mount Greenwood, Roseland, and West Inglewood. These are the 12 communities that have, there are more than 3,000 people for each doctor. Again, we live in the United States, right? When you look at asthma and lead prevalence, right, Southside children have greater exposure to lead per the Chicago Health Department, and Inglewood has the highest lead rate, where 9.15% of the children who were tested came back with a positive lead, showing lead poisoning, right? This is important because lead in your blood causes all kinds of issues. Other health issues has been linked to violence and all these and learning disabilities and all of that. So again, we live in older homes. Many of them have issues with lead paint and all of that, and it's impacting our children. So let's talk about in Illinois the black farmers. The number of black farmers in Illinois has gone from 893 in 1920 to 98 today. Why is this important? We just talked about a food desert, right? And then we have a shortage also of farmers, and the ones who do have some land left still are having problems meeting, paying their taxes and holding on to the land and actually investing in it, because some people foolishly think that they escaped or migrated from the South to come to Chicago, right? So farming somehow is not something we should do. Well, try survive without eating, right? And then you begin to value and respect what farming is. But why is this thing about farming important? Because in the past, black farmers were discriminated against by the federal government, and they had filed a lawsuit, and when they filed a lawsuit, they just kept holding it up, because everything with us, right, is, we go through lawsuits and judgments are given, but it's always something to get it implemented, right? So in 2007, fewer than 30,600 farmers in the nation were African American, compared to 233,000 farmers in 1920. We have less farmers today than we had 100 years ago. Farming is important because this past discrimination has created a barrier. Farmers were not able to get loans like others. A lot of times people keep saying, why these black people won't get it together, why they won't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, how about you don't have any boots? Sometimes that's a problem, right? And a lot of people who are not black have been entitled to so many things that the government has given as far as programs through the years. And they don't understand that discrimination when you went to apply, how we were treated. And so some of these lawsuits actually acknowledge that, and then because of poverty and lack of access, some of our farmers didn't file in time, and they tried to hold them up with that because they didn't really do any outreach to the community. They always find some way to circumvent justice, right? So the decline in black farmers also has to do with a lot of farmland is heredited, right? You inherit it from your family. Well, if you've been dispossessed or not given that access, then there's nothing to hand on. And then many, like I said, lost their land through whatever means, and so we have nothing to pass on to our children. Land is important, right? It's the only thing that doesn't change, right, and is valuable, and most of generational wealth is usually built on that. So let's go and talk about the psychological violence. What must it be like to live in a community where your life is in jeopardy on a daily basis, where you have to shuffle just to survive, where your dignity and pride are assaulted at every turn, where you're treated like a third world citizen in a seemingly first-rate society, a society whose benefits you're consistently denied access to? That's the stress of black life in America, right? So who's protecting our human rights? Each of us. Everybody has family members or personal experiences where we have harassment from the police, driving while black, we have an overuse of force. I mean, right now we have all this stuff going on, from Ferguson and Baltimore, Texas. Listen, every place in this country. The only difference is that this is nothing new, folks. The only difference is that now it's on the big screen, right? But black people know that this has been happening to us a long time. That's why the jails are filled with us. So we have had voter denial, Jim Crow laws, lynching, medical experimentation, convict leasing. We've had redlining. We've had just driving while black. So what's the second indicator for human development? It's educational achievement. And in today's public schools, success for African Americans is too often elusive. Our society still bears a legacy of a long history of racism, exclusion, and low expectation for African American children. And our public education system has not adequately responded to remedy this situation. And I'm reading from an executive summary that was done in Washington State. I've lived in a lot of different states in the country, and it's the same thing. right? This persistence challenge is deeply harmful to the African American community in our state, our nation, and our democracy. With every passing year, the danger mounts and the danger to our future grows more acute, they say. Lower rates of high school graduation lead to less employment, higher rates of incarceration, to ill health, substance abuse, intergenerational poverty. So we should care, right? All of us should care, because if we're spending money to incarcerate people or spending more money on health than we need to, we could have been using that to generate income in more positive ways. So in Illinois, black-white student achievement gaps are among the largest in the country. There's a gap between African Americans and whites of 33 percentage points, 33, okay? Race matters, again, in Chicago's public school system, it is 91% non-white, right? It's about 45% Latino, about 38% black, and you can see the difference in the outcomes of those children. We have a predominantly what we call minority, that's not even the word I like to use, but non-white population, and I believe that that is the reason why you see so much of the disparity in educational achievement. So we have fewer than 3 in 10 children enrolled in state-funded preschool, right? So we have 29% of our children enrolled in state-funded preschool. Well, when you're coming from very poor backgrounds and maybe your parents are not as academically up to speed as they need to be, you need more children as a society going to preschool, okay? So when you look at the 33% of Illinois' 4th graders are proficient in reading. But when you break it down by race, 12% of blacks children are proficient in reading at the 3rd grade, right? At the 4th grade. This is below the Latinos, which is 18%. Now they speak Spanish and we speak English. How come our children are performing at such a low level? When you look at 8th graders, when it comes to math, 10% of our children are on level, right? 10%. The gap between whites at 44% and us is 34 points. We should be concerned. How can our children graduate from high school when if they're leaving the 8th grade and only 10% of them are on level with math? Most of the jobs that are going to be higher paying are going to be in the technology field. You need math and science. 10% is unacceptable. When you look at the issue of poverty, right? Poverty does matter. But it seems to matter more in the black community because when you're out in the school system, you see children coming from Asian and white and or Hispanic community, and they're poor, right? But somehow there's a difference in their attitudes towards school, etc. And that's having an impact, right? When you look at Chicago, you see that North Lawndale has a 45.3% poverty rate. East Garfield has a 45.4%, Burnside 47.5%, Inglewood 47.8% poverty rate, and Riverdale 58.3% poverty rate, right? This is entrenched poverty. The children coming in, I'm in the public school systems, and I see they don't even bring pencil and paper sometimes, right? And this is like you go to some schools, they never ask for pencil or paper. You go to our schools, they're always asking for pencil and paper. Well, you're coming to school, you need to be prepared. But is it because of lack of resources? Some of it is, right? So this poverty has an impact. Chicago public schools also have a third of the state's low-income students. Now, something that people should be concerned about is that Chicago, there was a NPR that had a big story last week about how Chicago has been playing with its graduation numbers, and it's real. But what's interesting is how they tout performance, right? 11% of CPS students are college ready. 11%, right? I mean, 89% are not ready. Where is the outrage about this? Recently, we closed 50 schools, and people were up in arms. And I can understand, because some of those schools are anchors in our community. But folks, while they were open, were the children learning anything? That needs to be your issue, right? Are the children learning anything while they are there? And what role do you have to play in this? It takes 4 things or people, I say, to make a child successful in school. 1, the child needs to know why he's going to school. A lot of times when I spoke to kids, they don't know why they're going to school. right? They need to know why they're going, and they need to buy into it, that this is about improving self, not the teacher, not your parents, but yourself. Then your parent. Your child can't come home and then the child has all this noise and TV and distraction and all these people walking through the place. You don't even have a clear spot for the child to do the homework. You don't take the child to the library. You don't read to the child. You don't encourage your child to read. The homework isn't done. Come on, folks. The schools can't work miracles. You have to participate. And then it takes a school being part and believing in your child, right? That this child has the ability to learn and is going to go the extra mile. But all of us have to go the extra mile. The child got to go the extra mile, the parents got to go the extra mile, and then the school got to go the extra mile. And the fourth part is the government, because the government has to provide the funding to make sure that this is correct. But in a lot of countries across the world, we don't spend as much as we do on education, and their children are brighter than ours. So it's not just the money, it's the attitude, right? So what we're going to do about that? When I pull up the data on a number of the schools in our communities, many of them are low performing. So in our communities, we need people to begin to do needs assessment of your school, right? Schools can't have 2% of the children doing the PSAE composite, right? I mean, that's your standards. They're taking these tests. They need to pass them. They've been in the system a long time. They're in high school now. So what have they been learning? This is educational fraud. All these children going through, all these people collecting money, and yet the children come out and are of no use to us except to head off to jail, where they're going to feed the prison industrial complex, right? So other people are going to continue to make money off of us because we are not making sure that our children are getting a proper education. And when you look in the school system, even though black teachers made up less than 30% of the teaching force in Chicago, when you had the layoffs due to the school closings, they were the biggest hit. 51% of those laid off were African Americans. I'm an African American. And when my children go to school, they need to see people who look like me. If I'm Latino, I need to see people who look like me. In fact, when I've been in the classrooms, and you're in classrooms where children speak in Spanish, and their teachers speak Spanish, and the teacher comes from the same cultural heritage, it makes such a big difference in the child, right? Especially the little ones. They need to feel secure. They need to have that mother and father image. And in our schools, we need to have more black men. We need to have more black women in the classroom teaching our children. So we go now to the third indicator of the Human Development Index, which is called a decent standard of living, right? Which is your median earnings. And when you look at Illinois, when it comes to poverty, this is always so interesting. Poverty allegedly is 14.7% of the population, right? But when you look at the numbers and break them down again by race, of that number, 31% of the poverty is black people, right? And again, I told you, when you come into many of our Chicago communities, we're running at 45 to 58.3%, okay? So when you see overall figures, people, don't be impressed. Always want to know how the different races are, because if you don't, you get lost in that. So who are the face of the poor in Illinois? Black people. Latinos have a 20.7% poverty rate. Black people have a 31.6% poverty rate. So we are the ones who are poor in the state of Illinois. When it comes to liquid asset poverty, minority households, 55.9% of them are doing poorly. Nearly 1 in 2 black males aged 16 to 24 is unemployed in the state of Illinois. But in reality, when you look at it, it's higher than that. In Chicago, black males are 92% unemployed. This is black youth, teens, right? So when you see a lot of this violence, they ain't got nothing to do. And you got nothing to do, and things happen. When it comes to homelessness, homelessness ties in with the poverty, right? And even though this data that I'm showing you says that we are 24.8% of the population in Chicago, it's really higher. It's 33%, about 33%. It shows that of the people who are homeless, it's 83% black. So what is it saying? That we are overrepresented by almost 50 points, right, on who is homeless, while whites, who make up about the same 30-something% of the population in Chicago, are 3.5% homeless, right? So they obviously have the jobs, right, and they have the homes, and they're doing well. When it comes to poverty and homelessness, it's the black community. So this impact is impacting the children, right? 4 out of every 10 poor child goes to school hungry. Thank God for the school programs that actually do feed them. And many times some of the children are coming in and they're coming from they're coming from a shelter or a homeless situation. When you look at Illinois, again, you look at jobs and income, right? And you look at youth unemployment, and what we've seen is a big drop in black male employment from the 1970s to 2000. And we know that has a lot to do with the closing of factories and stuff like that, right? And that is we're still disproportionately unemployed. Black unemployment in Illinois in 2013 was 17%, right? White was 7.9, Hispanic was 11.1, okay? So again, we're disproportionately represented. African American women, it broke down that 17% to 14.9% for them and 19.6%. So you see a gap between the male and the female, and we're still the highest. They say we have, the question I want to ask is, why is this gap acceptable, right? Every time a crisis happens, like now we had a little Great Recession, right? And people will say, oh, it was because of the Great Recession. Really? For the last 6 decades, black unemployment has been 2.5 times that of whites, right? So when you hear them on the radio touting, oh, unemployment rate is down and economy is great, really? For who, right? So when you look at some of the cities in Illinois, like Chicago Heights and Harvey and Kankakee and North Chicago and East St. Louis, from 2007 they were having high unemployment rates. So this is not because of the Great Recession. This is a fact of life for black people in America and in the state of Illinois in particular. Like I said, in Chicago, 1 in 2 black males aged 16 to 24 is unemployed. In Illinois, 1 in 2 is unemployed. In Chicago, 92% of the black teens were unemployed in 2013, and across the nation, 83% are unemployed. So when you see what's going on in Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York and LA and all these places that black people, children live, right? It's the same pattern. Now, let's talk about weekly earnings. One of the big things that surprised me when I was doing the data was that the highest paid person when it comes to weekly wages in the U.S. is Asian, right? And when you looked at black people, black women made 79% of what an Asian woman made, and black men made 67%. That comes out to like $313 a week for a man, $156 a week for a woman. So my question is, what would they do with an extra $313? That's times 400, that's $1,200 a month, right? You see the difference? You see why we're suffering and we have poverty? And this great disparity trickles over into so many other things. Median net worth for black households in 2011 was $6,446, and it was lower than it was in 1984 when it was $7,150, right? While white household net worth was almost 11% higher. We're actually in a time where there's going to be a tremendous transfer of wealth, right? The baby boomers are getting ready to retire, and they're going to be transferring all that wealth to their children. Black people will miss out on all of that, right? All of that. High-earning married black people, households, have on average less wealth than low-earning married white households. Because a lot of your assets is in your home and it's generational wealth, and because of racism and what has happened to us historically, we now see the impact, but we have nothing to pass on to our children. In Illinois, from 2000 to 2012, the African American population actually declined by 1.6%, while Hispanics grew 27.1% and Asians 33.2%. So you can see what's going on, right? What you have is 46.5% of the people who are foreign-born living in Illinois actually come from Latin America. So you're seeing an insurgence of Latino people coming in, people from Asia, Europe, and it's making a difference again. Again, they're coming for opportunity, they're getting it, but what about the people who have been here, whose ancestors helped to build this country? Now let's go to our communities. Our communities are like war zones, right? In 2014, Inglewood was considered the #1 deadliest hood. You had 259 people wounded. You had 49 people dead, a total of 308 people, right? So these communities that we're living in are like war zones. You have Austin coming up second, Garfield Park, Humboldt Park, South Shore, Auburn, Gresham, South Chicago, Roseland, and the list goes on. You'll see it in the slide. Black lives need to matter. They need to matter to us, because if it mattered to us, then we would nip this in the bud. But as you can see, if you have a 92% youth unemployment, right, what are they doing with their time? They're not doing very well in school, and they don't have no jobs because we didn't create anything. We've allowed people to come into our communities and own every darn thing. The dollar stays 6 hours in our community, right? Stays a month in the Asian community and 20 times in the Jewish community, right? And stays 6 hours in our community. Why? Because we don't own a darn thing. The high unemployment has led to high poverty, which leads to higher black on black violence. People who are stressed, who are tired, who got all kind of issues, you get short-tempered, things happen, right? The best cure for violence is employment that we need to create for ourselves. When you look at who is killing who in Chicago, 68.8, so almost 69% of the attackers were black, and 78.1%, so 78% of the victims were black. So this is our problem, people, all right? This is our problem. We are killing each other. And then you also have police killing people, but we have to stem this violence. This is impacting our community and killing our children. On weekends, you have a shooting spree between 3 and 9 p.m., and you have murder and mayhem, right? So we know when it's happening. We also know that it happens in the afternoons when the children come out. So what does that mean? It means that when we're thinking of solutions, we have to think of solutions that are going to impact that. We need after-school programs, right? They're going to keep the children busy. Many of our children are coming into school already way behind. So again, can we find some solutions that are based on our reality? Not some figment of someone's imagination, but our reality. So who are we protecting? A lot of in our community, right, we have no suspect charge. Really now? Nobody know who shoot these people? Right? Nobody know who shot these people. So that means that you could be from a baby right up to your elderly grandmother and getting shot. And nobody knows who did it, right? We got to stop this, because the only people, again, who are being impacted by this violence is us. We have to begin to address the family structures and what the 40-plus year war on drugs, which is really a war on black communities, has now created in our family structures and economic base, right? Why does the community not feel comfortable cooperating with law enforcement? Because half the time they don't look like us. Half the time they don't come from us. You go to Inglewood, right, and you speak to the commander, who's a nice fella, and he'll tell you that Inglewood is a training facility, right? It's a training district. So we have youth. The youth ask the commander, so why do we not get a chance to know these policemen? Because every time we look at somebody new. So then we learn it's a training facility. So with Inglewood being the top of the list, do you really think that this should be the training facility? Who are you here to facilitate? Our community or yourself? Inglewood should not be a training facility, right? It should not be. We need police who look like us, who do community policing, and we need them to stick around. Train them somewhere else. So who is killing our children? Another big thing that has happened is Congress is finally going to make local law enforcement report on how many people were killed, right? When the police kill you, they never had to put it in the data, right? So now they have to, there was a law passed, some of them are not complying. But in 2015, 508 people, as of today, have been killed across America. Right? 11 were killed in Illinois, and of that 11, 5 were black. I did tell you we were 14% of the population, right? So how come 5 of the 11, which is almost 50%, is black people killed by the police? And you look again, you see another pattern. You have schoolhouse to jailhouse. Black youth are still disproportionately targeted by these arrests. They represent 42% of the CPS students, and they account for 75.5% of the school-based arrests. Now, let's be honest. I've been in the schools, and in some of those places, some of them kids are off the chain. But is arresting them the solution? No, it's not the solution. Some of them are coming from some very dysfunctional backgrounds. You can see by the aggression that some of them have, and this is not in all the schools that I've been in, but in some of them. And you can see, and you talk to the children, they'll tell you, they got bigger brothers or other family members who are bullying them. So when they come to school, what do? They bully others. It's a cycle, right? Hurt people, hurt people. Again, in our community, can we come up with solutions that are about us? Again, stop trying to fit into other people's role model. It's not working, right? These children need intervention. They're after all children. They should not be arrested. America has the highest number of prisoners in the whole darn world, right? We should be ashamed of ourselves. But that ties into the 13th Amendment. Slavery has been abolished except you are incarcerated. You have seen since 1865, or actually 1877, when the Democratic Ku Klux Klan came into power, right? And I'm not talking about, it's not a figment of my imagination, this is what was happening. And you see the mass incarceration. Laws put into place, Jim Crow, to incarcerate us so they could get that free labor again. When you end up in prison, you're a free labor again, you're a slave. That's what the 13th Amendment says, right? So in Chicago, you have 78.1% of youth of the arrest is youth. Youth arrests, right, are black. 78.1%. And you see a disparity because 70% of the drug arrests happen in Cook County and 70% involve African-American youth. Yet the data will tell you that racial disparity is striking, considering that many studies suggest white youth are more likely to use substance, especially hard drugs, than black youth. So how come more of them get arrested, right? If you have a crisis, like now they're having a crisis with heroin and all that in the suburbs, they're going to find resources to make sure those kids get it. But when we have a crisis in our community, what do we get? More jail cells. And actually, they're not building any more prisons, they're just squeezing them tighter in it. They take out all the programs, and all they do is put them in there and turn them into hardened criminals. So the event of an arrest is truly a life-altering for anyone taken into police custody and their families. We've got to work to prevent youth involvement with the police and criminal delinquency from happening. Because once they end up there, if they weren't hardcore, by the time the system is finished with them, they certainly now are. We don't have anybody and children to throw away, right? There was a study that came out that talked about the missing people in our community and how many missing, thousands of black men have been missing from our community because of being caught up in the law enforcement and criminal injustice, right? And so now we don't have those men as fathers in our community. I see it when I'm talking to children. A lot of them will say their parent, their father, either they're not in the home or they're locked up, right? So their whole life they either go visit somebody in prison. That's not a normal thing, people, right? So now even though they have sensational media reports that talk about how many youth are arrested, in reality they're only about 17% of the people who are arrested. So even though 78% of that 17% is black, and that should be of concern to us as black people, it's still not, it's only 17% of the arrests are children or teens. Community members have got to find ways, right? Because when youth are arrested, not only do the parents, if your parent have a job, now they have to go to court, they have to spend time in court, then they lose their job, right? Which, poor people can't afford this, or they usually have jobs where they don't get paid while they're out, right? So the ramifications of all of this is long-term and actually adds to the poverty. We have to find new and creative ways to reach the young people before they're arrested or become attention of the law enforcement. And one of the slides that I'll show you is the racial breakdown of percentages of youth and arrests by district. Listen, people, it doesn't matter what district we're in and what percentage of the population we are. When it comes to the arrests, we're big. Huh? This is a problem. And part of that problem is that even though the city of Chicago is about a third Hispanic, a third black, a third white, when you look at the police force, it's probably like 50% white. You want to tell me, well, if you keep arresting all these black people, you won't have anybody left to be able to become policemen, right? But this is not rocket science. You cannot have a disproportionate amount of people who don't look like us in our communities, and then everything we do because they don't understand our culture is intimidation and arrest of the children. So today, 2006, black working age men behind bars. If you're 18 to 64, 1 in 12 or 8% have been incarcerated. If you're 20 to 34, 1 in 9 or 11.4% have been incarcerated. And if you don't have a high school diploma and you're between the ages of 20 to 34, guess what? 1 in 3 of you will be incarcerated. So there's a direct link between education and incarceration, okay? We're not giving them any opportunity to better themselves, to become that genius that they were made to be. And so we see they will find work for idle hands, and some of them end up in the prison justice complex. In 2011, black people represented 14% of the population in Illinois, and we represented 56.7% of the prison system. Why? Right? Why? We're 14% of the population and 56, almost 57% of the prison population system. There's a problem here, but we see the feeding, right? Children in the youth, schoolhouse to jailhouse. People, these are our children. What are we going to do about this? And we see the same pattern nationally, right? You'll see a small percentage of whites, Latinos, massive black incarceration. Education reduces incarceration. So what happens to these children whose parents are incarcerated, right? In Illinois, 70,701 children have no father or mother due to incarceration, right? What's the cost to our community? So when these children don't have any parents, they end up in foster care. So the state paying money for them to be incarcerated, paying money for them to be in other people's house, and they allegedly screen all these people for the children to be with. And half the time they're being abused and other things, right? Is this how we treat our most precious? The children bouncing from place to place, right? How does this create generational acceptance of incarceration when you have so many children whose parents are incarcerated? It's like nobody knows what it's not like to not have members of their family who are incarcerated. So we're having collateral costs because when these children's parents are incarcerated, it affects their emotional state, it affects their performance, it affects how they see themselves, it affects how they perceive they're going to do. Plus, now that income is gone, they're even more in poverty. It has tremendous impact. These are called the collateral costs of incarceration, right? So 1 in 9 black child has an incarcerated parent. 1 in 9. And when you look at what has caused a lot of this, some of this is drugs and violence. Those have been the 2 greatest indicators, right? And when it came to the black community, in the past, crack was a big thing, right? Crack came into our community, was like hell, right? So drugs and violence have been a big impact. 1 in every 28 children in the U.S., more than 3.6% now has a parent in jail or prison. What does that say about us as a society? This is the only option that we have? And missing parents impact the behavior of black children in schools and lead to higher suspensions and poor academic performance. So what you see historically is that while the crime rate went down, incarceration for black people went up. So people, our environment cultivates our communities, and our communities nurture our health. And racism impacts all of this, right? I told you before that in the black community, the dollar circulates every 6 hours, right? It leaves and it stays a whole month in the Asian community, and it stays 20 days in the Jewish community and 17 days in the white overall community. And when you look at racial wealth, the wealth gap, where black people have under $4,000 something, under $5,000 in assets, while white people have 110,000, you can see why, right? And then money is leaving our community before the even end of the day. So how can we change that? We have to remove barriers to opportunity that stand between the prison gate and the labor market. We have to contain the prison and jail growth. That is not the best use of our resources, right? And we have all these children who are not doing well in schools. We need some accountability from parents, from the children themselves, and from the school district. In Chicago, we had, and across Illinois, we have TIF funds, and they were supposed to improve blighted areas, but when you look where the money was spent, the Loop, near North Side, near South Side, near West Side, right? $1.56 billion of the $2.5 billion are spent there. And when you look at Pullman, Riverdale, Roseland, West Pullman, areas of poverty, 4.8 million. Million. Really, people? TIF funds are supposed to improve blighted areas by attracting construction and jobs. Don't you think with the unemployment rates that we've been talking about, and when we talk about 17%, it's really higher than that, because there's some people who just don't even bother to look anymore. They're so disgusted, right? Again, we have the homelessness issue, and then we have gentrification. We have a history of what happened to us from the 30s through the 60s. We were cut out of the legitimate home mortgage business, and then in the 2008 and a little bit before that, you saw a reverse redlining, right? Steering minority neighbors into high-cost mortgages, resulting in a flood of foreclosures. So you go through the black community, and now you'll see empty lot, board-up house, right? All of that. So anything that's bad, we always get plenty of, right? My goodness. So the banks found new ways to rape our community. And when you look at gentrification, you have what they call white avoidance. In Chicago, neighborhoods that are too black don't gentrify. I have a problem with gentrification, right, if we part of it, because we would like to live someplace nice too. But why is it the only time the place can look nice is when you bring in all these other people, right? That's discrimination again. So what you're seeing is a displacement of black people, and you'll see the slide that shows you from 1990 to 2010, and you see a lot of Latinos moving into our communities, right? I have a problem with Latinos moving to our communities. I have a problem with we don't have the same options. So 177,000 black people left, used to live in Chicago between 2000 and 2010. We have dropped 1.6% in the state of Illinois. Where are we going? What's going on? We have 2 black banks left in Illinois, right? Illinois Service Federal Savings and Seaway Bank and Trust. And when you look at that, there used to be 23 African-American owned banks with assets totaling $4.8 billion, right? That's 0.43, not even 1% of our alleged 1.1 trillion in buying power. When you look at the Asian banks, they have 42.1 billion. Okay? We have 4.8 billion. Come on, people. Why are we not putting our money in our own banks? So Asa Hillard says, real self-destructive behavior occurs when we identify so strongly with our oppressors that we do to ourselves the worst that they could do to us. That is, rather than wait for our culture to be destroyed, we commit cultural suicide and enter voluntary cultural servitude, uncritically embracing alien cultural forms, even destructive and incoherent ones. It is in this process we lose the glue or the ties that bind us together as a people. At worst, group solidarity crumbles in the face of a love affair with individualism, and an individualism that loses its cultural mooring. That's what you're seeing happening in the black community, right? You're going to school and the children are more concerned with sneakers. Really? You're not learning anything, because sometimes you won't participate in the learning process. And your sneakers are more important, and how you're dressed. These are values that the parents taught them, okay? So we're undergoing what I call the 5 elements of the crime of genocide. Genocide by killing, genocide by causing serious bodily or mental harm, genocide by deliberately inflicting conditions of life, calculated to bring about physical destruction, all of this squeezing in our community, this poverty, this crime, this incarceration, oppression, genocide by imposing measures intended to prevent births. That's why you can predict in 2050 that we will be 11.9% of the population, and genocide by forcibly transferring our children. So our children are transferred into other people's homes and they just have a chaotic life. How are they supposed to build? How are we supposed to have a future if the children are being destroyed? So what we're seeing today is observable residual behavior of what we call African Holocaust victims. They have a lack of knowledge about themselves, their history, their culture, their worldview, their religion. They have poor self-image. They devalue black skin, right? They place high value on light skin and straight hair. They have their alienation from themselves and the community, and they evaluate themselves based on a European standard. There is over-identification with their oppressors. That's why all these women got all this weave and spending all this money on that rather than the children, right? Imitation and modeling behavior of their oppressor, creating black people who practice internal racism. That's why you can have a black cop forcing a gun down a black man's throat, right? He is perpetuating the same self-hatred. You have unrewarding interpersonal relationships carried over from enslavement, and you have practices of self-destructive behavior. And we take out our frustration and anger about racism on self and those who represent. I mean, why are we shooting up one another? Is that who our enemy is? So we have problems with leadership, right? I told you we have more black leaders today than we have ever had. And yet, look at the state of our community. So where before we could call a white leader a racist because of the things that were happening, now we got this black talking heads, talking foolishness, right? And because the skin is black, we don't understand that they now are the voice of oppression, okay? So communities are victims of divide and conquer, and religious images prepare themselves to worship whites in general. That's what you're seeing, right? I don't want to pray about this anymore. I want to do something. I want us to do something. So I told you before, Milton Friedman says, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. He said, this, I believe, is the basic function. We're going to develop alternatives to existing policies to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. Black people, aren't you tired of other people's agenda being forced on you because you have failed to create your own agenda? African Development Plan is calling for a 50-year agenda for our communities. Here in Chicago, ground zero, across the nation, and globally. Okay? It's time for us to get it together. So, this presentation is, again, coming from Global City Unity as part of a program, and it's tying into what Dr. Claude Anderson says, right? There are 5 stages to creating power in our community. The first is economic, the second is political, the third is legal, the fourth is media, and the fifth is education. Folks, we have to have an economic base in our community. My number is 773-431-2788. And again, you can find me on the website, www.african, A-F-R-I-C-A-N, development, D-E-V-E-L-O-P-M-E-N-T, plan.org. You can see me at my blogs at cecilejohnson.com, CECILEJOHNSON.com. You can find African Development Plan on Facebook. And you can write me by email, same African Development Plan at gmail.com. But what I'm looking for is some people with some courage and consciousness. Nobody's coming to rescue us. We have enough information to rescue ourselves. We just need to be united around it. We must be united.